you shall be put to death by lethal injection.
You know, every town has one. That one family that seems to have it all. In Oak Ridge, Colorado, that was the Miller family. And at the center of that family was a boy named Noah. If you picture a classic American high school hero, you're picturing Noah Miller. He was the star quarterback with the easy smile, the kind of kid who got good grades without even seeming to try. When he walked down the hallways at school, it was like the sun parted clouds for him. Teachers loved him, classmates wanted to be him, and parents pointed him out to their own kids as an example. He was the golden boy, plain and simple. And then there was Lucas. Lucas was 16, 2 years younger than Noah. And if Noah was the sun, Lucas was the permanent, quiet shadow it cast. He wasn't unpopular or bullied, not really. It was worse than that. He was invisible. While Noah was off at practice or parties, Lucas was in his room, door closed, lost in the blue glow of his computer screen. He was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes adults nervous. He had this way of looking at you without ever really seeming to see you. His parents, David and Sarah, they loved him, of course they did. But loving Lucas was like trying to hold on to smoke. You could never quite get a grip. I want you to picture a specific day. It was the day of the homecoming parade. The whole town was lining Main Street. The air was crisp, smelling of autumn leaves and popcorn from the vendors. And there was Noah, riding on the back of a convertible, holding the championship trophy over his head, beaming. The crowd was roaring for him. And I want you to see, just for a second, a figure standing off to the side, under the brittle branches of an old oak tree. Lucas. He wasn't cheering. He wasn't smiling. He just watched. His hands were shoved deep in the pockets of his dark hoodie, and his expression, it was completely blank. Not angry, not sad. Just empty. Like he was watching a nature documentary about a species he couldn't quite understand. Later that night, the Miller family sat down for dinner. From the outside, it was a perfect scene. A nice house, a well-made meal, a successful father, a caring mother, 2 healthy sons. But inside those 4 walls, the air was thick with things left unsaid. David, the father, was talking about Noah's prospects for a college football scholarship. The scout from state said he's never seen such a natural arm, David said, his voice full of pride. Noah, to his credit, tried to include his brother. Lucas, you should come to the game next Friday. It's gonna be crazy. Lucas just pushed his peas around his plate with his fork. The sound of the tines scraping on the ceramic was the only answer he gave. His mother, Sarah, tried to bridge the gap. Lucas, how was your day? Did you finish that history project? He shrugged, not even looking up. It was fine. 2 words, flat and lifeless. You could see the frustration and worry warring on David's face. Son, look at us when we're talking to you. We're your family, not the wall. Lucas finally looked up, and his gaze was so cold, so detached, that for a second, David just stopped talking. The moment passed. The conversation awkwardly moved back to Noah, back to the sunlight, leaving Lucas in his shadow. After dinner, Lucas vanished into his room. Down the hall, Noah's room was a mess of sports gear and college pamphlets, vibrant and alive. Lucas's room was a tomb. The walls were bare. The only light came from his computer monitor, where he'd be scrolling through forums most people never see, dark, twisted corners of the internet. The blue light reflected in his eyes, and if you could have seen him in that moment, you wouldn't have seen a troubled teen. You would have seen a strategist. A planner. You would have seen a ghost, slowly deciding it was tired of being unseen. The chapter ends with Sarah Miller standing in the hallway later that night. She looks at Noah's closed door, and a smile touches her lips. Then she looks at Lucas's closed door, and her smile vanishes, replaced by a deep, cold fear she couldn't explain. She reached out, her hand hovering just an inch from the wood, but she didn't knock. She just turned and walked away, that unease settling in her stomach like a stone. She had no idea that behind that door, the son she was trying to understand was already slipping away, replaced by something else entirely. Something that was about to make sure the whole world finally saw him. The thing about tragedy is that it rarely announces itself with a scream. Sometimes, it starts with a phone call. For an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived next door to the Millers, it started with a sound. It was well past midnight, and the suburb of Oakridge was wrapped in that deep, heavy silence only a sleeping town can have. Mrs. Gable was up, getting a glass of water, when she heard it. Not a scream, at first, but a sharp, loud pop. Then another. It didn't sound like a car backfiring. It was cleaner, more final. And it came directly from the Miller house. She stood frozen at her kitchen sink, the water still running. Then, she heard the last sound she would ever hear from that house. A single, terrified scream. It was cut off almost instantly. Swallowed by the night. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she rushed to the phone, her hand shaking so badly she could barely press the numbers. When the 911 operator answered, her voice was a frantic whisper. There's something wrong at the Miller's house. I think I heard gunshots. And then a scream. Oh God, the house is all dark. Just 12 minutes later, the first police car pulled up, its lights painting the quiet street in frantic flashes of red and blue. There were no sounds coming from the house now. No signs of a struggle. Every window was a dark, blank eye. The officers drew their weapons, their footsteps crunching unnaturally loud on the gravel driveway. The front door was locked. The whole scene felt wrong. It was too quiet. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a weight. They called out. Police. Anyone inside? Nothing. Silence. Using a key obtained from a panicked Mrs. Gable, they unlocked the door and stepped into the foyer. The smell hit them first. A metallic, coppery smell that every officer recognizes and dreads. And then they saw the reality of what that silence contained. David Miller was found in the living room, slumped in his favorite armchair, as if he'd been taken completely by surprise. Sarah Miller was near the hallway, as if she'd been trying to run. Upstairs, in a room covered in sports posters, they found Noah. The scene was systematic. This wasn't a frenzy. It was something cold. Something calculated. And then a young officer, his voice cracking slightly over the radio, called out, "I've got one. I've got a survivor. In the basement." They found Lucas Miller curled up in a corner behind the water heater, in the cold, damp dark. He was shaking. Or at least, he was making his body shake. His clothes were clean. Spotless. There was no dirt, no dust, and certainly no blood on him. He looked up at the officers with wide, frightened eyes, the perfect picture of a traumatized boy who had just hidden for his life. He was their sole survivor. Their key witness. The only problem, the only thing that didn't add up, was the faint, fresh scratch on the lock of the back door. A scratch that the lead detective would note had been made from the inside. As if someone had locked it behind them. So now, the unthinkable tragedy had a face. A survivor. Lucas Miller was whisked away from that horrible scene, not in handcuffs, but wrapped in a blanket, treated like the victim everyone assumed he was. He was taken to the Oakridge police station, placed in a soft interview room, the kind they use for kids or trauma victims, with a comfortable chair and a box of tissues on the table. He was given a soda. He looked so young, so small sitting there. This was the first act of the play, and Lucas was performing perfectly. The lead detective on the case was a woman named Eva Rostova. She'd been a homicide detective for 15 years, and she had a gut feeling that was like a tuning fork. It started to hum when something was off. She walked into that room with a gentle smile, her voice soft. "Lucas, I'm Detective Rostova. I know you've been through a terrible ordeal. I just need you to walk me through what happened. Can you do that?" And Lucas, he nodded, his eyes wide. He took a shaky breath and began his story. He said he'd been in his room, on his computer, when he heard a loud noise downstairs. Not a gunshot, he said. Just a bang. He said he crept to the top of the stairs and saw 3 men. They were all dressed in black, he said, with black ski masks covering their faces. They were big, he said. They moved fast. He claimed he heard his father yell, and then another bang. He said he was so scared, he just ran. He didn't run out the front door, he said. He ran down into the basement, and he hid behind the water heater, squeezing himself into the darkest corner he could find. He said he heard more noises. Thuds. Another scream. He thought it was his mom. Then, he said, it just got quiet. Deathly quiet. He said he stayed there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, until he finally heard the police upstairs and called out. Detective Rostova listened. She nodded. She made reassuring sounds. But inside, that tuning fork was vibrating harder and harder. His story was clean. Too clean. It was the kind of story you'd see in a movie. The masked intruders. The brave hiding spot. But real trauma isn't like that. Real memories are messy, fragmented, illogical. Lucas's story was a perfect, logical sequence. And his emotions. They were there, but they were on a delay. He'd deliver a terrible line like, "I think I heard my mom scream," and then he'd pause, as if waiting for the feeling to hit him, and then his face would crumple. It was like watching an actor hit his mark. Then, there were the little things. The physical evidence that was starting to trickle in. One of the forensic techs slipped a note to Rostova while she was in the room with Lucas. It was about the back door. The scratch on the lock was fresh, and the metal shavings were on the inside of the doorframe. That door had been locked from the inside, not kicked in from the outside. When Rostova went back in, her tone was still gentle, but her questions became sharper. "Lucas, you said you ran straight to the basement. Did you touch any doors on your way? The back door, maybe?" He looked her right in the eye, his own eyes wide and innocent. "No, ma'am. I just ran straight down. I didn't touch anything." She leaned forward slightly. "You were in the basement for a long time. It's dusty down there. Your clothes are remarkably clean, Lucas. How do you think that happened?" For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear passed through his eyes. It was fast, like a shadow. It was calculation. He just shrugged, looking down at his hoodie. I don't know. I guess I just stayed really still." That's when Detective Rostova knew, with a cold certainty that settled in her stomach. This 16-year-old boy, sitting there playing the terrified survivor, was the most convincing liar she had ever met. He wasn't recounting a memory. He was reciting a script. And she was now absolutely determined to find out what he was hiding, and why the scene in that house felt less like a home invasion, and more like a stage that had been perfectly set for a performance. You've heard the saying, right? The internet never forgets. For most of us, that's a warning about an embarrassing photo or an old social media post. But for an investigator like Detective Rostova, it's a promise. It's a truth that, in cases like this, often becomes the key that unlocks everything. While Lucas was playing the part of the shell-shocked survivor in a soft interview room, Rostova was back in her office, staring at an evidence bag. Inside was Lucas Miller's laptop. It was a standard-issue school laptop, covered in a few stickers for bands no one's ever heard of. It looked so innocent. But Rostova had a feeling that inside this machine was the real Lucas Miller. Not the actor in the interrogation room, but the director. And she was about to pull back the curtain. With a signed warrant, their tech forensic guy, a man named Ben who survived on coffee and code, got to work. It didn't take him long to bypass the basic password. The first thing they did was check the browsing history. And what they found was nothing. It was clean. Too clean. Like it had been wiped. But as Ben explained, deleting your history is like throwing a letter in the trash. We just have to take out the trash and smooth out the paper. Using specialized software, he started recovering every single search query Lucas had made over the last 6 months. And that's when the picture started to shift from a tragedy to something much, much darker. The searches started out vague, almost theoretical. Things like, how to make an accident look real. Then they got more specific. Most common household poisons. Can ballistics trace a bullet to a specific gun? But the one that really made Rostova's blood run cold was a search from just 3 weeks before the murders, inheritance laws for minors in Colorado. This wasn't the random curiosity of a troubled kid. This was research. This was planning. But the browsing history was just the appetizer. The main course was yet to come. Ben, his fingers flying across the keyboard, found a hidden partition on the hard drive. A secret folder, encrypted and tucked away behind a fake system file. It was protected by another password. Ben tried a few obvious ones. Lucas's name, his birthday, password. Nothing. Then, almost on a whim, he typed in Noah. The folder unlocked instantly. The final, cruel insult. Using his brother's name as the key to his own destruction. Inside the folder were two things. The first was a file simply titled Journal. It wasn't a diary of feelings and teenage angst. It was a ledger of hatred. Entry after entry, written in cold, precise language, detailed his resentment. Noah got the scholarship letter today. The old man couldn't stop smiling. Like he built him with his own two hands. Another entry read, "She keeps asking what's wrong. I wish I could tell her that the mere sound of her voice makes my skin crawl." But the most damning entry, the one Rostova read aloud in a hushed whisper, was dated the night before the murders. It consisted of a single chilling sentence. "Tomorrow, the ghost becomes the king." The second thing in the folder was a series of encrypted messages from a dark web forum. A place where people with twisted minds gather to share their fantasies. Lucas's username was Silent Shadow. In these chats, he wasn't a quiet boy. He was boastful. He talked about resetting his life and cleaning the slate. He asked for advice on obtaining a weapon without a paper trail. One user, with the screen name Acheron, gave him a step-by-step guide on how to buy a ghost gun, a firearm built from parts, with no serial numbers, ordered online. The final message from Acheron was, "Good hunting, Shadow." Rostova immediately got a warrant for the school grounds. Based on the journal's hints about a hidden king, they focused on the one place associated with his brother's glory, the football field. Under the cover of darkness, with metal detectors, they searched. And there, buried 6 inches deep right at the 50-yard line, Noah's territory, they found it. A handgun, wrapped in oiled cloth inside a plastic bag. It was a ghost gun. Untraceable. And when the ballistics report came back a day later, it was a perfect match. This was the weapon that killed David, Sarah, and Noah Miller. Back in the soft interview room, Lucas Miller was still playing his part. He sat with his shoulders slumped, occasionally sipping the soda they'd given him, the picture of exhausted grief. He'd been telling his story about the 3 masked men for what felt like the 100th time, and he was sticking to it, line for line. It was a flawless performance. But on the other side of the two-way mirror, Detective Rostova was done watching the show. She had the script in her hands now. She had the journal, the search history, the murder weapon. It was time for the final scene. She took a deep breath, gathered a file full of printouts, and walked back into the room. This time, her demeanor was different. The gentle smile was gone. Her posture was straight, her movements economical and precise. She didn't sit down across from him right away. Instead, she paced slowly behind his chair, letting the silence stretch out, making the room feel smaller, tighter. "Lucas," she began, her voice flat and professional. "We've been talking about your story. The 3 men in black. Hiding in the basement." She stopped pacing and placed the first piece of paper on the table in front of him. It was a printout of his search history. "Can you explain to me why, for the last 3 months, you've been searching for undetectable poisons and inheritance law for minors?" Lucas's eyes flicked down to the paper. For a fraction of a second, the exhausted look vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, cold calculation. He recovered quickly, shrugging. "I don't know. For a school project." Rostova didn't react. She placed another page down. This one had a single line from his journal, blown up in large font. "Tomorrow, the ghost becomes the king." "What does that mean, Lucas? What happened tomorrow?" He stared at the words he himself had written. He said nothing. His jaw tightened. Then, she placed the final piece of evidence on the table. A photograph of the ghost gun, still caked in dirt, lying on an evidence bag. "We found this, Lucas. Buried at the 50-yard line on your brother's football field. It matches the gun that killed your family." We traced the parts to a dark web vendor. To a user named Silent Shadow. That was the moment the performance ended. The shaking stopped. The wide, fearful eyes went flat and dead. The carefully constructed mask of the traumatized boy melted away, revealing the chilling emptiness beneath. He didn't confess. He didn't break down crying. He didn't get angry. He just went still. And then, in the heavy, silent room, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of joy or triumph. It was a smirk. A cold, contemptuous curl of the lip that said, "You figured it out. So what?" Detective Rostova leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "Lucas Miller, you are under arrest for the murder of David, Sarah, and Noah Miller." As she Mirandized him, he said nothing. He just maintained that eerie, placid silence. When two officers entered to cuff him, he stood up calmly and offered his wrists. But as they led him out of the room, through the bustling bullpen of the police station, a reporter who had been waiting on another story saw him. And that reporter, acting on pure instinct, raised his camera. The flash went off. And in that single, frozen frame, they captured it. Lucas Miller, in handcuffs, being led away for the murder of his own family, looking directly into the lens with that same unmistakable, cold-hearted smirk. That photograph. I want you to understand the power of that single image. Overnight, the story exploded out of Oak Ridge, Colorado, and became America's nightmare. It was everywhere. On the morning news, the anchor would show the old, smiling Miller family photo, and then, right next to it, they'd flash that picture of Lucas in handcuffs, with that cold, empty smirk on his face. The contrast was so jarring, so morally offensive, it took everyone's breath away. The quiet town of Oak Ridge was suddenly flooded with satellite trucks and reporters from New York and Los Angeles. This wasn't just a local tragedy anymore. It was a national Rorschach test. And everyone saw something different. On one side, you had the majority. The outraged, the horrified. For them, it was simple. The evidence was overwhelming. The premeditation was clear. The smirk was the final proof. This wasn't a boy. This was a monster in a teenager's skin. Talk radio hosts thundered. He planned it. He researched it. He executed it. And he smiled about it. The death penalty is too good for him. Social media erupted with hashtags like #JusticeForTheMillers and #NoMercyForMonsters. For these people, Lucas Miller was a symbol of pure evil, and the only just response was to make sure he never saw the outside of a prison cell again. He was a predator, and society needed to be protected from him. But on the other side, a quieter, more complicated conversation was happening. In university lecture halls and therapists' offices, people were asking harder questions. What creates a child who can do this? They wondered. Psychologists went on cable news, pointing to the smirk not as a sign of joy, but as a symptom. They used terms like conduct disorder and callous unemotional traits. They argued that Lucas wasn't a monster. He was a profoundly sick, broken child. A product of an environment he found unbearable, living in a shadow so deep it snuffed out his own humanity. The debate became nature versus nurture, cranked up to a terrifying volume. Was he born broken? Or was he made into a killer? And right in the middle of this firestorm, two people were gearing up for the fight of their lives. First, there was the prosecutor, Angela Graves. She was a force of nature in the courtroom. In her 50s, with a steely gaze and a reputation for being utterly relentless, especially in cases involving children. But her sympathy for children ended when the victim was a child. She saw the Lucas Miller case as the clearest, most black-and-white case of her career. She told her team, "This is not about understanding him. This is about holding him accountable. He made a calculated choice. Now he faces the consequences." She was going for the maximum sentence possible. She was going to ask for Lucas Miller to be put to death. And for the defense, there was Mark Devlin, a public defender who genuinely believed in redemption. He was a kind-faced man in his 40s, but with the tired eyes of someone who had seen the very worst the system had to offer. He didn't see a monster when he looked at Lucas. He saw a deeply disturbed, mentally ill teenager. His mission wasn't to prove Lucas was innocent. It was to save his life. He was going to argue that executing a 16-year-old, no matter what he had done, was a barbaric act. That Lucas's age and his broken mind were reasons for mercy, not excuses. And through it all, where was Lucas? He sat in a juvenile detention cell, isolated for his own protection. He showed no interest in the media storm. He didn't ask for the news. When Mark Devlin visited him to discuss strategy, Lucas was polite, but distant. He seemed more interested in the legal process itself than the outcome. He'd ask questions like, what kind of evidence can they suppress? Or, how does an appeal work? He was treating the biggest moment of his life like a complex math problem. The human cost, the 3 lives he had erased, seemed to mean nothing to him. The world was screaming about him, and he was just waiting. The courthouse in Oak Ridge looked more like a fortress that morning. Police barricades held back a crowd of reporters, protesters, and just plain curious onlookers, all buzzing with a grim energy. Inside, the air was cold and still, smelling of old wood and floor polish. This was it. The day the facts of the nightmare would be laid out in the bright, unforgiving light of a courtroom. Lucas Miller was led in, dressed in a simple, ill-fitting button-down shirt his defender, Mr. Devlin, had provided for him. The cameras weren't allowed inside, but every person in the gallery, every reporter, every family member, every citizen who'd managed to get a seat, stared at him. They were looking for a monster. They were looking for a broken boy. But what they saw was nothing. His face was a blank page. He walked calmly to the defense table, sat down, and barely seemed to notice the hundreds of eyes burning into the back of his head. The judge, an older man named William Montgomery with a face like weathered stone, called the court to order. His voice was deep and calm, a steady rudder for what everyone knew would be a turbulent ship. Then it began. The opening statements. First up was Prosecutor Angela Graves. She stood, smooth and formidable, and walked to the jury box, looking each of the 12 men and women in the eye. "This case," she began, her voice clear and sharp, "is not a mystery. It is a spreadsheet." She laid it out, cold and hard. The premeditation, the internet searches, the ghost gun, the journal entry. The defendant didn't snap. He budgeted. He didn't have a tantrum. He executed a business plan. A business plan for the murder of his own family. She pointed a steady finger at Lucas. He looked at his father, his mother, his brother, and he saw obstacles. Problems to be solved. And he solved them. Permanently. Then, it was Mark Devlin's turn. He stood up, looking less like a warrior and more like a weary doctor delivering a difficult diagnosis. He walked to the same spot, but his posture was softer. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice laden with sadness. "What happened in the Miller home was an unspeakable horror. There are no winners here. Only loss." He didn't deny the facts. Instead, he asked them to look behind them. "You've seen the what? But the real question, the only question that matters, is why?" He gestured to Lucas. What kind of profound suffering, what kind of deep, untreated sickness, exists inside a child that leads him to this? We are not asking you to excuse what he did. We are asking you to understand the broken machinery of his mind before you decide to throw the entire machine away. Throughout both of these speeches, one painting him as a cold-blooded CEO of murder, the other as a symptomatic, shattered child, Lucas Miller did the same thing. Nothing. He didn't flinch at the gruesome details. He didn't react to the portrayal of his own mental state. He just sat, occasionally writing on a legal pad with a calm, steady hand. He was the still, quiet eye of a massive, emotional hurricane. And his silence, in that room full of sound and fury, was the loudest, most chilling thing of all. After the prosecution's case, with its mountain of physical evidence, the mood in the courtroom was heavy, almost resigned. It felt like a verdict was inevitable. But Mark Devlin, Lucas's defender, knew he couldn't fight the what. He had to fight the why. His entire case rested on one desperate, high-stakes gamble. He wasn't going to try and prove Lucas didn't do it. He was going to try and prove that Lucas couldn't understand it. He was going to argue that the boy who pulled the trigger was so mentally and emotionally broken that the person sitting at the defense table was more of a ghost than a guilty man. To do this, he called his star witness to the stand, Dr. Ira Vance, a court-appointed forensic psychologist who had spent over 20 hours with Lucas. Dr. Vance was a calm, scholarly man with glasses, and he spoke not with drama, but with a quiet, unsettling authority. Devlin walked him through his findings. Dr. Vance, Devlin began, based on your evaluation, can you diagnose the defendant? Yes, Dr. Vance replied, turning slightly to the jury. Lucas Miller exhibits the classic, severe symptoms of a conduct disorder with what we call limited prosocial emotions. In simpler terms, he is callous and unemotional. Devlin then did something very clever. He took the prosecution's strongest evidence and tried to reframe it as a symptom. The extensive planning. The internet searches. The journal. What does that tell you? It doesn't tell me he's evil, Dr. Vance explained calmly. It tells me he's impaired. Most teenagers are driven by impulsive, emotional reactions. Lucas is not. He is driven by a cold, detached calculus. He sees human beings not as feeling creatures, but as variables in an equation. Removing his family wasn't an act of passion. To his broken mind, it was the most logical solution to his problem. Then, Devlin approached the heart of the matter. He brought up the one piece of evidence everyone remembered. The smirk. Doctor, how do you explain the defendant's expression upon his arrest? That smile. Dr. Vance adjusted his glasses. That is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of his condition. It is not a smile of joy or triumph. It is what we call an incongruent effect. His internal emotional wiring is so faulty that the correct emotion simply doesn't manifest on his face. In a moment of high stress, where you or I would feel fear or panic, his brain short-circuits. That smirk is a neurological misfire. It is the void where a feeling should be. For a moment, it was working. You could see some jurors leaning in, thinking, "Oh, so he's sick." Mark Devlin was slowly, carefully, trying to dismantle the monster and assemble a patient in its place. But then, it was Prosecutor Angela Graves' turn. She stood up slowly, a predator who had been waiting patiently. She didn't just cross-examine Dr. Vance, she dissected his testimony. Limited prosocial emotions, she repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air. That's a very clinical, very sanitized term, isn't it, doctor? It sounds a lot better than remorseless, doesn't it? Those are the clinical terms, Dr. Vance said stiffly. Let's talk about this faulty wiring, she continued, her voice like sharpened steel. You say he sees people as variables. Does that faulty wiring prevent him from understanding right from wrong? No, intellectually, he knows the rules. Does it prevent him from planning? From making decisions? No. So, Graves said, turning to the jury with a piercing look. He knew it was wrong. He was capable of planning it. He was capable of executing that plan. His so-called condition just made him efficient. Is that it? She didn't wait for an answer. She picked up the journal. This neurological misfire managed to write a very coherent, very hate-filled journal. This broken mind managed to navigate the dark web and procure an illegal firearm. His condition, doctor, didn't make him incompetent. It just made him better at being a killer. By the time she sat down, the gamble was laid bare. Devlin had asked the jury to see a sick boy. Angela Graves had forced them to look, once again, at a highly capable, highly dangerous individual who simply didn't care. The medical jargon now felt like an excuse. A fancy wrapper on a terrible, simple truth. After all the clinical talk of psychology and ballistics, the trial now entered its most human and most brutal phase. The victim impact statements. This was the moment the three names, David, Sarah, and Noah Miller, would stop being just victims in a case file. The judge called for silence, a solemn respect falling over the room. This was not for the lawyers, or even for the jury. This was for the families. And for Lucas. The first to speak was Sarah's mother, Eleanor. She was a small, silver-haired woman who seemed to be held together by sheer will. Her voice was a fragile thread, threatening to break with every word. She held a photograph of her daughter. "My Sarah," she began, her eyes fixed on Lucas, who stared blankly back. "She spent her life caring for children. She brought them into the world. She comforted them when they were sick. She would have moved heaven and earth to help you, Lucas." Her voice cracked. "And you treated her like a piece of garbage to be taken out. The silence in my house now, it's so loud. It screams that she's gone." She didn't yell. She just wept, her grief a physical presence in the room. Next was David's brother, Michael. He was a large man, a construction foreman, and his grief came out as a raw, shaking anger. He leaned into the microphone, his knuckles white. "My brother dedicated his life to teaching kids. He believed in building people up. He believed in you." He glared at Lucas, his voice trembling with fury. "You didn't just kill a man. You killed a legacy. You're not a man. You're a coward. A plague on the memory of a good family." The bailiff shifted, ready to step in, but Michael just shook his head in disgust and sat down, the air crackling with his unspent rage. The last was a surprise. It was Chloe, Noah's girlfriend. She was only 17, her face streaked with tears. "Noah talked about you all the time, Lucas," she whispered. "He worried about you," he said. "I just wish I knew how to reach him." She looked directly at Lucas, her voice strengthening with a heartbreaking maturity. "He wanted to help you, and you murdered him for it. You didn't just take my boyfriend. You took the homecoming king. You took the team's captain. You took the future father my children will never have." Throughout all of this, the weeping, the anger, the shattered dreams, Lucas Miller did not move. He didn't look away, but he didn't seem to be seeing them either. It was as if he were watching a play in a language he didn't understand. No remorse. No shame. Not even annoyance. Just nothing. A void. The evidence has been presented. The experts have testified. The victims have been remembered. Now, there is nothing left but the words. The final powerful arguments meant to cement a version of the truth in the minds of the 12 jurors who hold a boy's life in their hands. The air in the courtroom was electric, a hush so deep you could hear the lights humming overhead. Angela Graves stood first. She walked slowly to the jury box, placing a hand on the railing, connecting with them. She didn't need notes. The facts were her script. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "For days, you have heard about a troubled child. You've heard about broken wiring and incongruent affects. Do not let fancy words cloud the simple, brutal truth." She held up the photo of the ghost gun. "This is not a symptom. This is a choice." She held up the journal entry. "This is not a cry for help. This is a mission statement." She walked them back through it, step by cold, logical step. The research, the planning, the execution. This was not a crime of passion. It was a corporate takeover. A hostile takeover of 3 lives. He saw his family as assets and liabilities on a balance sheet, and he decided to liquidate. She then turned and pointed directly at Lucas. And when he was caught, he didn't break down. He didn't confess. He smirked. That smirk isn't a neurological misfire. It is his signature. It is the final, contemptuous period at the end of his terrible sentence. Her voice softened, but it lost none of its power. "Your job is not to understand the monster. Your job is to protect the village from it. The only just verdict, the only verdict that honors David, Sarah, and Noah Miller, is guilty. On all counts." Then, it was Mark Devlin's turn. He looked tired, the weight of his impossible task bowing his shoulders. He approached the jury not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant. "He is right," Devlin said, his voice quiet, forcing the jury to lean in. What Lucas Miller did is unforgivable. There is no argument there. He acknowledged the horror head-on, disarming them. But your job today is not just to decide what he did. It is to decide who he is. And who he is a child. He gestured toward Lucas. We do not execute the sick. We do not kill the broken. We heard from experts that his mind does not work like yours or mine. That he is adrift in a cold, dark sea inside his own head. Angela Graves calls him a monster. I call him a profound and tragic failure. A failure of his own mind, and yes, a failure of the world around him to see how deep the damage went. He pleaded with them, his voice cracking with genuine emotion. To take his life now would not be justice. It would be a continuation of the same violence that started this. It would be another life erased. Do not complete his terrible work for him. Find him guilty. But then, choose life. Choose to lock away the broken machinery, not to smash it to pieces. As both lawyers sat down, a profound silence filled the room. Two stories had been told. One of a cold-blooded predator. The other of a terminally ill child. The jurors' faces were unreadable, a wall of concentrated thought. They had been given two different worlds, and now they had to choose which one was real. The jury was out for less than 6 hours. Think about that. After all the evidence, all the testimony, all the dramatic arguments, it took 12 people less time than a long afternoon at the movies to decide the fate of Lucas Miller. When the buzzer sounded in the courthouse, signaling that a verdict had been reached, the sound was like an electric shock. It pulsed through the building, pulling everyone, reporters, family members, lawyers, back into the courtroom. The air was thick enough to choke on. Lucas was led in, the same blank expression on his face. He might have been walking into a dentist's appointment for all the emotion he showed. He sat down, straightened his cuffs, and waited. Prosecutor Angela Graves sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table. Defense attorney Mark Devlin, however, couldn't keep still. He tapped a pen, he adjusted his papers, he took a long, slow drink of water. The stakes were too high for calm. Then the door beside the jury box opened. The 12 men and women filed in. This was the moment everyone looked at their faces, trying to read the verdict before it was spoken. But their faces were stone. They had been instructed to show nothing, and they were perfect at it. They didn't look at Lucas. They didn't look at the grieving family members. They looked straight ahead, at the judge. The bailiff brought the folded slip of paper to the judge. Judge Montgomery unfolded it slowly, his face giving nothing away. He read it to himself, then handed it back to the bailiff, who took it to the jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes that were now utterly devoid of expression. The judge spoke. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, we have. The clerk took the paper. On the count of the murder of David Miller in the first degree, how do you find the defendant? The foreperson's voice was clear and steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. We find the defendant, Lucas Miller, guilty. A gasp, then a muffled sob from the Miller family's side of the room. The clerk continued. On the count of the murder of Sarah Miller in the first degree, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. Another wave of emotion. On the count of the murder of Noah Miller in the first degree, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. With each guilty, it was like a nail being hammered into a coffin. The legal foundation of Lucas's life was being dismantled, brick by brick. Angela Graves allowed herself a single, sharp nod. Mark Devlin closed his eyes, a wave of defeat washing over him. And Lucas? He listened to the 3 guilty verdicts, and he simply nodded. Once. A small, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. As if he were a scientist whose hypothesis had just been confirmed. There was no anger, no surprise, no fear. Just acceptance. The performance was over. The truth was now the law. A verdict of guilty doesn't end the story. In a death penalty case, it just opens a new, even darker chapter. The sentencing hearing. This is where the law stops being about facts and starts being about the value of a human life. The same courtroom, the same players, but the atmosphere had shifted. The question was no longer, did he do it? The question now was, what is his life worth? Prosecutor Angela Graves stood to make the first argument. She was no longer trying to convince them of guilt, she was making a case for death. Her voice was stripped of all theatrics, leaving only a cold, hard certainty. "Your Honor," she began, looking directly at Judge Montgomery. "There are certain crimes that are so heinous, so beyond the pale of human decency, that they shatter the very contract we have with society. The murder of a parent. The murder of a child. Lucas Miller committed both. 3 times over." She laid out the aggravating factors like stones building a wall. The crimes were especially cruel, committed against a person's family members in their own home. They were premeditated, planned for months with the cold efficiency of a corporate merger. And the defendant has shown a profound and utter lack of remorse. She paused, letting the weight of that last point settle in the silent room. Remorse is the thread that connects a criminal to humanity. It is the signal that somewhere inside, they understand the damage they've caused. Lucas Miller has severed that thread. He has shown us nothing but contempt. From the smirk at his arrest to the blank stare through the victim impact statements. To give him life in prison would be to grant him exactly what he wanted. A new, controlled environment where he can continue his cold, calculated existence, all at the taxpayer's expense. The only just sentence, the only sentence that truly reflects the totality of his actions, is death. Then, it was Mark Devlin's turn. He looked like a man who had not slept in weeks. He carried the weight of trying to save a life that seemed determined to be thrown away. "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Lucas Miller is a broken boy. We can debate the reasons, we can debate the terms, but that is an undeniable fact. To take his life now is not justice. It is revenge." He pleaded with the judge to see the mitigating factors. His age. He is 16. His brain is not fully formed. His mental capacity, while intelligent, is emotionally stunted. He is a product of a sickness that was never treated, a cry for help that was never heard. He turned and gestured to Lucas. Killing him doesn't bring back David, Sarah, or Noah. It doesn't heal the community. It just adds another body to the pile. It makes the state a killer. Life in prison without parole is not a soft option. It is a slow, grinding, and permanent punishment. It is a living death. It allows for the possibility, however small, that one day, in the silence of a cell, some flicker of understanding might ignite. The death penalty extinguishes that possibility forever. Then came the moment few were expecting. The judge looked at Lucas. "The defendant has the right to allocution. Mr. Miller, is there anything you would like to say before this court passes sentence?" Every head turned. Every breath was held. This was it. The moment for a tear, an apology, a final, desperate plea for mercy. Even a single word of regret could change everything. Lucas Miller slowly rose to his feet. He stood straight, his cuffed hands in front of him. He looked not at the judge, not at the weeping family, but at some distant point on the wall. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy. And then he spoke. Just 2 words. His voice was flat, clear, and utterly devoid of any feeling. "I'm bored." A collective, sharp intake of air sucked the oxygen from the room. Someone in the gallery let out a strangled cry of disbelief. Mark Devlin put his head in his hands. Prosecutor Angela Graves simply stared, her face a mask of grim vindication. Lucas sat back down, as calm as if he'd just commented on the weather. In that moment, any last, fragile argument for his humanity evaporated. He had been given a final chance to connect, to show a glimmer of the child he once was, and he had chosen instead to deliver his most profound and devastating insult yet. He wasn't just remorseless. He was utterly, terrifyingly indifferent. The courtroom was frozen. The 2 words, "I'm bored," still hung in the air, toxic and unbelievable. The moment for pleas, for mercy, for anything resembling humanity, was gone. It had been extinguished by the very person whose life was on the line. Now all that was left was the judgment. Judge William Montgomery looked down at Lucas, and for a long, painful moment, he said nothing. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He looked like an old man carrying the weight of a terrible, final duty. He cleared his throat, a rough sound in the perfect silence. When he spoke, his voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the room, every word chosen with the care of a man carving an epitaph. "Lucas Miller," he began, "we have sat in this room for weeks. We have listened to the facts of your life and the details of your crimes. We have heard from experts about your mind. We have heard from a family shattered by your actions." He paused, his eyes never leaving the boy. "And we have heard from you. We heard your silence. We saw your smirk. And moments ago, we heard your breathtaking contempt for these proceedings, for the victims, and for this court." He leaned forward, his hands folded on the bench. "The law I serve requires me to look for mitigating factors. 4 reasons to choose life. Your defense attorney, who has fought for you with a passion you do not deserve, argued your youth. He argued your mind. But the law also recognizes that some actions are so grievous, they eclipse everything else." His voice grew stronger, filling the room. "You did not just kill 3 people, Mr. Miller. You annihilated a legacy. You executed a father who taught, a mother who healed, a brother who inspired. You did not do it in a fit of rage. You did it with the cold, patient precision of a sniper. You researched. You planned. You procured a weapon. You laid in wait. This was not a murder. It was an eradication." He addressed the heart of the defense's case. "This court has been asked to see you as a patient, a broken child. And I have looked. I have looked for a glimmer of the boy you might have been. But all I find is the void you have chosen to become. Your boredom is not a symptom, son. It is a statement. It is the final proof of a conscience so calloused, it is beyond repair." Judge Montgomery's gaze swept over the entire courtroom, including the jury, the families, and the reporters. "The law exists for 2 reasons: to administer justice, and to protect society from predators who would tear at its fabric. There is no rehabilitation for a soul that does not wish to be healed. There is no safe place in society for a person who sees human life as a variable in a tedious equation." He took a deep breath, the final one before the plunge. "You have been found guilty of 3 counts of murder in the 1st degree. This court has a singular duty to respond to that guilt with a sentence that reflects the severity of your crimes and the permanent danger you pose." He looked directly at Lucas, his voice dropping again, becoming almost paternal, which made it all the more devastating. "Lucas Miller, I have to believe that somewhere, buried so deep that even you cannot access it, there is a spark of what you could have been. And it is for that lost boy, and for the 3 beautiful lives you stole, that I say this. I sentence you to the one thing your own actions have proven you cannot be trusted with: life." A confused murmur started, but he wasn't finished. He continued, his voice ringing with finality. "I sentence you to have your own life taken from you." He picked up the formal document. "It is the judgment of this court that you shall be remanded to the state penitentiary, and there, at a time and manner prescribed by law, you shall be put to death by lethal injection. May God, in His infinite mercy, have more compassion for your soul than you had for your own family." That sound. The crack of the gavel. It's a sound you've heard in 100 movies, but in real life, in a moment like this, it's different. It's not dramatic. It's final. It's the sound of a tomb ceiling. For a single, suspended second after the sound faded, nothing happened. The courtroom was a photograph. Then, reality rushed back in. A wave of muffled sobs from the Miller family's side of the room. A reporter scrambling into the hallway to be the first to break the news. The stiff, formal movement of the court bailiffs as they moved toward the defense table. Lucas Miller did not flinch. He didn't look up at the judge. He didn't turn to see his weeping relatives. He simply stared straight ahead at the wood-paneled wall, as if he had just been told the time of day. As the bailiffs approached, he stood smoothly, offering his hands to be recuffed with the practiced calm of someone who had expected this all along. This was the final calculation in his plan, and it had come to pass. The void within him had not been filled by the verdict. It had been confirmed by it. Prosecutor Angela Graves slowly gathered her papers, placing them neatly into her leather briefcase. She didn't smile. She didn't look triumphant. She simply gave a single, sharp nod, a businesswoman closing a difficult, necessary deal. Her job was done. Justice, in its most severe form, had been served. Across the aisle, Mark Devlin seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 seconds. He slumped in his chair, his head bowed. He had fought the law, and the law had won. He had fought for a soul, and he had lost. There were no more legal maneuvers, no more passionate appeals to a higher morality. There was only the cold, hard fact of the sentence. He had failed. As the bailiffs led Lucas toward the side door, the one that leads back to the cells and not to the free world, he passed by Detective Eva Rostova. She had been standing in the back, watching it all unfold. Their eyes met for a split second. And in that moment, Rostova saw something she would never forget. The blankness was still there, but beneath it, just for a flash, she saw something else. It wasn't fear or regret. It was a cold, quiet understanding. A recognition that the game was, indeed, over. And then it was gone, and he was led away, the door clicking shut behind him. The judge stood and left the bench. The families were ushered out. The reporters scattered. The courtroom emptied, until all that was left was the silence, and the ghost of those 3 words that had sealed his fate more than any evidence ever could. I'm bored. Outside the courthouse, the world reacted. News alerts buzzed on phones across the country. Teen killer sentenced to death. For most people, it was a headline. A moment of grim closure before they scrolled to the next thing. But for the people who lived it, the aftermath was a quieter, more complicated thing. The Miller family relatives left through a side exit, shielded by deputies. There were no tears of celebration, no sense of victory. They just looked hollowed out, as if the finality of the sentence had taken what little energy they had left. The great weight of justice had been placed on the scale, but it didn't bring back what they had lost. It just left a different kind of emptiness. Inside, Angela Graves packed her briefcase, the click of the latches sounding unnaturally loud in the empty courtroom. She had won. She had gotten the ultimate penalty. But as she walked out, her heels echoing in the marble hallway, her face was etched with a deep, professional weariness. There was no joy in this. Only the somber satisfaction of a terrible, necessary job completed. And Lucas? He was processed into the system, traded his suit for a prison jumpsuit the color of dried cement. As he was led down a sterile hallway toward his new permanent home on death row, he passed a reflective window. For a fleeting moment, he caught his own gaze. And in that split second, the emptiness in his eyes seemed to deepen. It wasn't regret. It was more like a final, cold confirmation of everything he believed about the world. That it was as hollow as he was. Then he looked away, and the moment was gone. Detective Eva Rostova stood in the now-vacant parking lot, the Colorado wind whipping at her coat. The case was closed. The monster was behind bars. But the why still echoed in her mind, a question with no answer. She got in her car, but she didn't start the engine right away. She just sat there in the silence, realizing that some stains, no matter how much justice you pour on them, never truly wash out. What happens after the sentence? For most of us, the story ends. But in the legal system, a death sentence is just the beginning of a long, slow, and grinding process. It's a ghost that can haunt the courts for decades. Lucas Miller's case entered that phase. The machine of appeal whirred to life. His court-appointed lawyer, a new one specializing in this exact, dark field, filed motion after motion. They argued his age again. They argued that his original lawyer was ineffective. They argued that the intense media coverage made a fair trial impossible. It was a desperate, paper-based battle fought in windowless offices, far from the drama of the courtroom. Years began to slip by. Lucas, now in his 20s, sat on death row. He didn't fight the appeals, but he didn't help them either. He showed no interest in the legal papers, no hope for a different outcome. When his lawyer visited to discuss strategy, Lucas would listen politely, then ask questions not about his life, but about legal technicalities, as if he were studying a complex game he was no longer playing. One by one, the appeals were denied. The state Supreme Court upheld the sentence. A federal court reviewed the case and found no error. With each denial, the path ahead narrowed, the walls closed in just a little more. The outside world mostly forgot about Lucas Miller. He was no longer a headline, just a name on a docket, a case number in a slow-moving system, inching its way toward a foregone conclusion. It ends where it began. In the dark. On a cold, clear night, years after the trial, retired Detective Eva Rostova found herself standing on a patch of scrubland, staring at the distant lit-up walls of the state penitentiary. Inside, Lucas Miller was hours from his execution. She hadn't planned on coming, but she felt compelled to be a witness, not to his death, but to the silence that would follow it. She didn't go in. What would she say? There were no questions left to ask, and he had never had any answers to give. She just stood there, her breath misting in the air, thinking of the two images forever linked in her mind, the smiling family photo and the boy's cold, vacant smirk. She realized, with a heavy finality, that the law could deliver a sentence, but it could never provide an answer. It could extinguish a life, but it could never fill the void that life had become. Justice had been served, but peace remained out of reach, for everyone. A distant siren cut through the night, and then it was quiet again. Eva turned her back on the prison and walked away, the chill settling not in her bones, but in her soul. This was a story that asked a terrible question. What does justice look like when the unthinkable happens? If these kinds of stories, the ones that live in the gray areas of the human soul, make you think, then subscribe. Because next week, we're telling a story about a lie that saved an entire town, until the truth dug its way out.